barriers that I also identified, which were financial investments and as well as investments of time into avenues that can actually affect structural change. And I think you just did a great overview of that. And the only thing that I would add to is that, I mean, I know as students right now, for the most part, you might be broke, it's fine. I'm there too with you. We've all been there. But I think there should be a tendency not to just look to corporations, but to look to your local groups and local organizations. And if you can't invest money, maybe investing time there to add to that long-term and that sustainable change that Chu spoke to. And so also in terms of barriers and challenges, I think one thing is, as I touched upon before, a discomfort and a wanting to be comfortable and polite all the time, especially in Canadian society. And that means that there's often a tendency to try and avoid difficult conversations. Mind you, nothing will get achieved if we don't at least start to speak to it. And I think that at this stage, we are speaking and having more of those more difficult conversations. And I think Chu gave some great tips in terms of how to incorporate that in the classroom in terms of, I've noticed X, or why is this that way? And so asking those questions, not only I think in sort of more classroom settings, but all around you so that you can, in your active every day, do that process of learning and unlearning. I think there's a tendency to look over the mundane and how that might actually affect your intentions, your narratives, and your beliefs. So I think in terms of a big challenge is often, I think, to look to other groups, not look to our own groups or ourselves individuals when approaching EDI. And so one thing I will say then is to really try and seek to learn and continuously improve in terms of your understanding. The learning never stops. It's not a race, that being said. It's definitely not a race. So I think it's about taking the time to sit with it, research, listen, time and time again, not just as a student, but seeking out opportunities to do that when you're in the workplace. Being in the legal profession, I've noticed that it's more difficult to be in spaces where I'm maybe learning about Indigenous issues or learning about queer struggles when it comes to being in the workplace. So I think it's about actually finding your community and making sure that you stay rooted in that and those values. And last, I will say in terms of a challenge that I've noticed in terms of being part of institutions, educational institutions, is that a lot of folks in education know that students are a transient population. So one thing I will say, if there's any student organizers out there listening, is to try and make sure that you're passing on all the challenges, the lessons, and the obstacles and the grit that you've experienced and learned to those coming behind you. And with that, I will pass it to Jared.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think biggest challenges, and it sounds a little bit cliche, but I mean, for me, what I've seen working in schools and in workplaces, when I was at Queen's in Kingston in 2009, I guess I started. So it was a long time ago now. You know, that campus looked like a very different place. And we heard earlier about the other one of the previous speaker talk about you know, you know, visibility and seeing in people there. When I was at Queen's, I had come from Trent University, and we had over 10% of our population was international students at that university. And so when I came to Queen's, I really noticed in 2009, I know there's been lots of work since then, but I noticed very visibly. And I went and worked at York after at Queen's. I left and worked in Toronto. And I remember very specifically after being in Kingston for 4 years by that point, I remember going on campus at York and seeing, you know, an African-American man. And I was like, I hadn't seen one for so long because I'd worked at the university and Queen's just didn't have, you know, at that time. And so I think, you know, visibility is really important. And so that's a barrier potentially at Queen's. And I worked to help alleviate that, for example, with Indigenous people. You know, we can't have, it's harder for us to have visibility in a school where you have to have, a 95 average to come out of high school to get into a program, when my reserve doesn't offer academic programming past grade 11. So then I have to move to the city to finish high school when I'm 13, right? Like there's differences that are in play. And how does an institution like a school deal with that? The other thing that I think of, as I've said before, studying human resources in 2005 in university, was very different. So it kind of, equity and inclusion and diversity was kind of called diversity. It was like one chapter in the book. And it was like very much like an area that you have to study in order to solve conflict. It was kind of how it was positioned. And the business case where it may get, like, it has evolved quite substantially since that time, in my perspective. But one of the things that I found, a core piece that I find a barrier, coming from a perspective around working on D&I, especially on the indigenization front, is that understanding of the concept of equity versus equality. What is the difference on that? And I know, Chu, I see this a lot in the States, and the sort of sometimes a lack of understanding of what equity is versus equality. And so understanding that the different concepts, I think, from someone from my generation, early millennial, I find when I'm working with senior people in corporations today, I find that it seems like a hard concept for them to understand. But for me, I got it. That was sort of what was burgeoning when I was in school. And so when you think about these kind of trends, I guess you can call them in D&I or EDI, for example, my generation, executives my age, really are struggling with sort of misgendering people. Like, it's not something that we ever learned about, and it's something that they struggle with, for example. And so there's a lot of different sort of big elements that keep moving along. And I think the question that I always ask is, what is next? What is the next thing going to be? Because there is going to be a next thing. There always is. We saw Idle No More, and then we saw Black Lives Matter, and then we saw, obviously with this last summer, we've seen the resurgence of, information being shared about residential schools, which the commission report came out 10 years ago. So there's ebbs and flows. And I think those are some of the barriers I feel that are existing, is trying to understand those trends and understand that those trends, I don't think they're going away. They probably shouldn't be happening, but that's just how it is. I think moving forward, I think those are the biggest challenges, is making sure that you're clear on some of those key concepts that do move. So we didn't even talk about equity versus equality when I was an undergrad. Now in business, it's very common. So so I think that's the other biggest thing, barrier. And then the other barrier is that I am, for example, if you're a student and you're coming into the workplace, and a lot of the barriers is going to be potentially, if you're a diverse person, or you identify as a diverse person. In my situation, a lot of the times, I was the only Indigenous person in the room. I was the first person from my community to have a graduate degree, and so I had to, and we heard about it before, those that are coming before. So I had to, in university, be the one that would say, human rights. It's nothing trumps human rights, or semi-constitutional. And I'd be like, no, like my rights are yours are in the charter, mine are in a treaty. And, I remember correcting my professors on these concepts. And I had to continue to do that in the workplace as I went in and started my career. I'm hoping that because I did that, hopefully others coming forward don't have to do that as much. But I really do think that there's other spaces where that's really sorely needed in other diverse groups. And so unfortunately, you may, as you come through your graduation and as you continue your education, you may end up having to be that person. And that can be a barrier.
Awesome, guys. It's really interesting to note like how you guys have all been at Queen's at different times and all before me. And I'm a current student here at Queen's, and me having the opportunity to kind of have difficult conversations it's really great, because even when I came in and I'm looking at all these sorts of clubs that Queens has, one of the things that they really kind of focused on was EDII. And it's interesting to note, like, when you guys were at Queens, there were certain barriers that you guys were dealing with, and you having those uncomfortable situations, like Asha was saying, and also questioning what we're learning. It's really interesting because we now are moving on from that. We're taking those steps forward, and it's really great. So with that, I would like to kind of ask you guys, when you guys, you're during your time here at Queens, was there any sort of, maybe not necessarily the name EDII, but was there any initiatives when you guys were in school that you kind of partaked in, like you guys really helped out, any EDII initiatives? And if so, how did that kind of help your journey here as a student, or how did it contribute to the work that you guys are doing now?
Yeah, so I think for me, I want to just bring two anecdotes. My first year, I moved into Leggett. I don't know if anyone here lived in Leggett, but we're friends now. I moved to Leggett, and I think what's really unique about the Queens experience, and I'll get into like the clubs afterwards, but you're forced, whether you like it or not, right? It's not like Toronto where it's such a big city, everyone's everywhere, but you're really forced, and sometimes in a good way, to make friendships. And for me, it was the person across the room, Emily. And I remember having this bond with her where I felt so comfortable that I shared with her, my 18-year-long secret of being gay. And I think being gay at Queens was not the norm, right? Because there's a Queens model that you're supposed to fit. And I think not just during my time, but a lot of the students that I speak to now, they feel like there's a Queens model that they have to fit into. But I think what Queens also allows under that facade is you have those friendships where you can have those difficult conversations. You can explore your, whether it's your ethnicity or sexuality or other aspects of your identity. But I think that really lends to having those difficult conversations because you have that level of trust. And I think for folks who are listening, I think one takeaway would be, how can you have some of the tough conversations that you don't want to ask people in public, but you want to start that conversation with your friends? And I think that's a good point to start with.